Now we are live, and good afternoon to Donal Fallon, historian, broadcaster, and I suppose podcaster to the foremost of Three Castles Burning, a fantastic resource for any history, any fan of history, no matter what parts of the world you come from. I think Three Castles Burning is very insightful, and it's a lovely way it's presented. I've certainly appreciated a lot of the episodes. So you're very welcome, Donal. Welcome to the shed, the virtual shed. As the people are still coming in and tuning in, and thanks very much for your time out there. Donal's going to talk us through the history of Bloody Sunday, November 21st, 1920, one of the bloodiest days in the capital and to a certain extent the country, but moreover, all the incidents that happened around the capital city that day. And I think Donal will speak to the geography and the mysteries and the quirks of these series of events, not just an event. And so look, without further ado, I'm going to hand over to you, Donal. Please send in your questions. I'm going to ask Donal a few questions at the end that come in from you shedders. So thanks a lot, Donal. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Frank. And this is the part that always makes me nervous. Sharing screen. We'll see if I get this right. If I get this right, it's all plain sailing from here. Can you see my screen?
Yes, you're up.
Brilliant.
You're live. Yeah, brilliant. Well done.
So all we're depending on now is the Wi-Fi and Kimmage, and if that plays ball, we'll be fine. Thank you everyone for coming along. Really, really nice to get to mark the centenary. Of course, last weekend was the centenary of Bloody Sunday with the men's sheds. I'm a great believer in the men's sheds and what they contribute to communities right across the island of Ireland. And, we might not be able to come together in person at the moment, but, the virtual shed, as Frank called it, will do. Bloody Sunday, I think for a long time, it's fair to say, was dominated by the memory of one event in particular. When we think of Bloody Sunday, we tended to think of the massacre in Croke Park. And even of that massacre, the 14 people who lost their lives, the point that I think was well made by the historian Michael Foley in recent weeks is that of the 14, 13 of them basically, were commemorated as a number. We knew how many people had died in Croke Park, but we didn't know the particular stories of those people, with the exception, of course, of Michael Hogan. And in this brilliant image, we see the unveiling of the original nameplate on the Hogan stand. The name of Michael Hogan is eternal. It's there, it's born in the stadium. But in recent years, and in particular as we move towards the centenary, I think a lot of good has been done in shining a light on the lives, all the lives that were lost on that dramatic day. And even in the crowd in Croke Park, as we'll hear later on, some incredible people from the broad spectrum of Dublin life in 1920. Now, for me, the thing about Bloody Sunday that's very, very important is to understand the scale of it. It's not just the events that happen in Croke Park when we're talking about Bloody Sunday. Really, there's three acts to this. It's a play in three acts. The day begins with the targeted assassination of suspected intelligence officers in Dublin. Much of that violence took place in the south inner city of the city, the south inner city of Dublin City, I should say, pardon me, Upper Mount Street, Earlsford Terrace, Upper Pembroke Street. That event triggered a bitter reprisal at Croke Park, home of the GAA. I think that is the part of the day we're most familiar with now. I mean, the brilliant commemoration last Saturday, for me, was one of the highlights of the decade of centenary so far. Michael Foley's book is entitled The Bloodied Field. For me, like the Abbey Theatre's contribution, they had 14 beautiful little plays exploring the lives of those killed in Croke Park. I think that's the most familiar part of the tale now. So today I'm kind of going to primarily focus on the bit I've researched in depth, which is the events of the morning, but we'll touch on Croke Park and then the final violent drama of the day, the death of 3 prisoners at Dublin Castle, including 2 very prominent Republicans who both would have been involved in the planning stages of the morning's operation. So we have a series of targeted assassinations in the morning, a bitter reprisal against the civilian population, and then the deaths of Republican prisoners believed to have been responsible for what had happened that morning. So these events are all interconnected in sometimes surprising ways, as we'll hear. And in total, 32 people lost their lives or died as a result of injuries sustained on the day. So we're looking at the intelligence war in Dublin, which ultimately led to the IRA taking the decisive action they did on the 21st of November 1920, the road to Bloody Sunday. We look at the events of the day, profiling some of the more overlooked fatalities from all three incidents of violence, and we'll explore the impact of the day. I mean, the big question has to be, did Bloody Sunday seriously weaken either the British Secret Service or the IRA in Dublin? And I think you might be surprised by the answer to that. Perhaps the IRA came out of it with a bloodier nose by the end. Intelligence is crucial in any revolutionary movement, of course, and certainly intelligence was the weak spot of the Republican movement in Ireland in the early stages of the Irish Revolution. It was revealed by the 1916 Rising, I think, the absence of any kind of significant counterintelligence network. And the fact that the G Division, the intelligence police, it always sounds very mysterious, G Division, the G-man. There's no great mystery to it, sadly. G is the seventh letter of the alphabet. They were the seventh division of the police. But the G-men, their job was political policing, you know, to get into radical organizations, to learn everything they could about these people, who they were, where they worked, who they met, what newspapers they were writing for, all that kind of stuff. G Division, based in Great Brunswick Street, that's Pierce Street Garda Station to me and you, they had totally penetrated the Republican organizations in Dublin. And in the aftermath of the Rising, the G-men were basically able to walk into Richmond Barracks, where the defeated rebels were kept, and identify the leaders and say, him, 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 him. These are, you know, the men who brought this thing together. They photographed people of interest in Richmond Barracks after the Rising too. Peter Clancy, the Clare man, who would be murdered at the end of the 21st of November 1920 in Dublin Castle. This photo of Peter is taken in the barracks. And I think looking at it, I always struggle with this picture. Look at his eyes. Is it a look of fear? Is it a look of defiance? I'm still not entirely sure what it is. But basically, it was very clear, I think, to the Republican movement after the defeat of 1916 that as far as intelligence was concerned, the British very much had the upper hand. The G-men were detested by Republicans. You could always spot them standing on the edge of a meeting, taking notes about people. One Republican newspaper wrote about a G-man, he's a secret policeman, though in most cases his secret is an obvious one, owing to the size of his general appearance. You know, these big, massive men in trench coats with notepads standing on the edge of political meetings. They follow men and inquire at the houses which they have visited. They travel on railways and report conversations. Now, they are the eyes and ears of the British state in Dublin. And, you know, primarily they're Irishmen, and primarily they're Dubliners. Now, Collins understood in the post-1916 world the need to confront this enemy, if you will, the intelligence machine. Our only way to carry on the fight was by organised and bold guerrilla warfare. But this in itself was not enough. England could always reinforce her army. To paralyse the British machine, it was necessary to strike at individuals outside the ranks of the military. Without her secret service working at the top of its efficiency, England was helpless. Robbed of the network of this organisation throughout the country, it would be impossible to find wanted men. So retrospectively, Collins, looking back, said that a guerrilla war would not have been enough if the British intelligence machine was not dismantled. And the first part of taking it down would be G Division in Dublin. But there's all kinds of other things you have to do. Counterintelligence, infiltrate the DMP, the G Division, very important. They are, until the summer of 1920, the most important eyes and ears on the ground. Infiltrate the postal system, vitally important to have sympathetic eyes and ears within the postal system, you know, to know what's coming in and out of certain addresses. The establishment of contact with people who worked in the likes of the hotel sector, very important, again, for knowing who's coming and going. And the establishment of contact with someone working within Dublin Castle. You know, Collins identifies all of these things as being fundamentally important to the intelligence war in Dublin. G Division turns, slowly but surely. In 1918, Collins makes real significant contact with Ned Broy, who works in Great Brunswick Street DMP station. In the Hollywood movie, for whatever reason, Neil Jordan had Ned Broy killed. I don't know if he felt enough people didn't die in the movie or something and had to knock a few more people off at the end. But Ned Broy loses his life in the Hollywood drama of Michael Collins. In reality, Broy went on to become a very senior guard in post-independence Ireland. There we see him in the uniform of An Garda Síochána. The special branch became the Broy Harriers. But, you know, having someone like Broy in the G Division giving information out to Collins is very, very important. And incredibly, Bry is such a committed Republican by this point that he doesn't seem particularly morally fazed with the knowledge that the information he's giving to Collins is going to lead to the death of some of his co-workers in that police station. He even allows Collins into the building in April 1919, absolutely extraordinary. A plaque on the side of Pearse Street Garda Station marks the fact today. April 7, 1919, during the Irish War of Independence, Michael Collins is permitted into a police station by Ned Bry, and he reads those DMP files. So there isn't enough hours in the day to correct every little thing about the Michael Collins movie, but in the film, Collins goes to Dublin Castle and he reads his intelligence file by candlelight. In reality, you can actually stand at the very door he went through on the side of Pearse Street Garda Station. And I think it says a lot about the confidence, the cockiness of the Republican movement that Collins was able to get in to that building on the invitation of Bry. And look, Bry was cold about it. You know, as far as Bry was concerned, if the G-men continued their activity against the volunteers and were allowed to do so with impunity, it was only a question of a short time until it would have a disastrous effect on the volunteers. You know, as far as Bry is concerned, the men that he works with, I mean, they may sit together in the staff canteen, but he thinks in pursuit of the Republic, as Collins sees it, these men will have to go. And he's quite ruthless about the need for that. And they're just knocked off one after the other. From the second half of 1919, it's quite remarkable. Detective Sergeant Smith, known as the Dog Smith, particularly unpopular with Republicans, gunned down on the orders of Collins outside his home in Drumcondra. Daniel Hoey, this one is very significant because they kill Hoey outside G Division headquarters at Great Brunswick Street as he's walking in the door to work. Detective Downing, the 19th of October, Detective Barton, the 29th of November. I mean, in 1919, the G-men are dropping like flies in Dublin. And one effect of this is that other G-men walk off the job. They don't want to be in a job that brings that kind of enormous risk. Who's killing them? The IRA's counterintelligence machine has a headquarters, 3 Crow Street, Temple Bar. I love the fact the headquarters is in Crow Street because it's relatively close to Dublin Castle. I mean, if you walk up to the top of Crow Street there and look right, you can more or less see where Dublin Castle is. You can see City Hall. So they're right under the nose of British state intelligence, of the British machine in Ireland. 3 Crow Street's a legitimate printing business. When you walk in, it's been that since the 1870s or whatever. You know, it looks like a legitimate printing business, but it's also the IRA's counterintelligence headquarters. And everything they do is being done from there. Charlie Dalton, a young lad, 17 on Bloody Sunday when he goes out to shoot and kill, you know, he remembered the work that they did from that building, everything. I was sent constantly to interview stewards, reporters, waiters, hotel porters, to verify our reports on the movement of enemy agents. Information was coming in from all kinds of places. Lily Mernon, a typist in Dublin Castle. Lily was known as the Little Gentleman, great code name, you know, if you're trying to keep a woman safe in a job like this. The Little Gentleman is leaking out nearly daily copies of information, confidential information to the IRA from Dublin Castle. And her bravery actually extended. In her time off work, she would go to social gatherings like the Phoenix Park Racecourse, the RDS, you know, places where senior kind of British oi polloi congregated. And sometimes she would bring IRA intelligence men with her as chaperones, as dates, and they'd keep an eye on who was there, what people looked like, how people interacted. Very, very important, Lily Mernon, because she's working behind enemy lines, so to speak. And she is vitally important to drawing up the list of names for Bloody Sunday, identifying the agents. The men who were knocking off the G Division and who will ultimately go into action on the morning of the 21st of November 1920 are known as the Squad. Some call them the 12 Apostles. 12 Apostles has a great ring to it, but ultimately the numbers involved in this kind of hit team, they ebb and flow depending on what's needed in particular operations. Standing at the back, Vinnie Byrne, right in the middle. Keep him in your mind because you'll see him again in a couple of moments' time. But these are primarily very young volunteers. They're not that young. I mean, a lot of them have been out in 1916. They've been in the Rising. So they may be 17, 19, 20, 21 at most. But a lot of them are already veterans of conflict. Crucially, I think it's important that they're young men for one kind of obvious reason, that they don't yet have families, and they have the bravery and the cockiness that comes with youth. And these young Dublin, very often very young working class inner city Dubs, are the front line, if you will, in taking out the G-men and later the violence of Bloody Sunday. I find this quote from Vinnie Byrne remarkable. It's quite cold. You know, we were all young, 20, 21. We never thought we'd win or lose. We just wanted to have a go. Young men, you know. We go out in pairs, walk up to the target and do it, then split. On a typical job, we'd use about 8, including the backup. Nobody got in our way. One of us would knock him over with the first shot, and the other would finish him off with a shot to the head. Remarkable. But I think by the end of 1919, the British understood that they were fighting something in Ireland that was more significant than they perhaps had initially given it credit for. And I think as those G-men were killed one by one in Dublin, there's a growing feeling in Dublin Castle, and there's a growing feeling in the corridors of power in London that you're not going to defeat the IRA with the Dublin Metropolitan Police 3 Division or even with RIC policemen in the countryside. And this is a brilliant, brilliant painting by Mick O'Dea. Fantastic. D.M. Leeson is the main historian of the Black and Tans in Ireland. And I think he's right. He says, you know, the IRA talked about the Auxies. Sorry, the IRA talked about the RIC like they were an army of occupation. But they were mostly a civilian force, and they weren't up for the job of counterinsurgency. And he makes the point that by the winter of 1919, I think the British state really knew that they had to up the ante. They had to take the gloves off, so to speak, when it came to fighting the IRA. So, one, what do they want? Well, they want men on the ground. What we know as the Black and Tans as the Auxies. And the Auxies, they recruit ex-soldiers and basically hire them as policemen, RIC police. They're not policemen, they're soldiers. Britain doesn't want to call them soldiers, I think, because they've just fought a 4-year war, and it's very hard to sell another war to the people of Manchester, Salford, Liverpool, Birmingham, Glasgow, and beyond. So they never want to acknowledge what they're fighting in Ireland is a war, but at the same time, they need soldiers. They need the tactics of a war, pardon me, and they know it. They also feel the need to bring in new intelligence, a step above what they've had in Dublin to fight the enemy. And by the end of 1919, the IRA was really confident. The Untitled newspaper, I find it amazing the IRA had a newspaper. You could buy this newspaper on the street in 1919. But the IRA's newspaper basically ends the year, price 2p, volume 1, number 14. The IRA newspaper ends the year by basically saying, you know, we're taking it to them. We're really giving them a fight. We're giving them blow for blow. Our soldiers have grown wonderfully efficient. We have an immense advantage in being in our own country among our own people. But I don't think the IRA was right to be so confident, because up until that point, they'd only really fought their own people, you know, the Irish cops of the DMP and the RIC, and things were about to get a lot more difficult for the IRA in 1920. The British make a lot of changes in that year. They bring in the big guns, you know, in politics, in the bureaucracy, in the castle, in a military sense. I mean, they bring in serious people, and they refer to the IRA only as the murder gang. You know, we're going after the murder gang. The policy of reprisals is brought in too. The British denied that there's a policy of reprisals in Ireland. And Hammer Greenwood, its greatest defender, says in Parliament, there's no policy of reprisals in Ireland, but if there is, it's working. And the policy of reprisals, of course, brings havoc to places like Balbriggan. It's an incredible image. International visitors to Balbriggan, not long after the sacking of Balbriggan by the Black and Tans. You know, the atmosphere in Ireland in 1920 is very different from how it was in 1919. It's very clear that the British are serious about stamping out the problem. They appoint Brigadier General Sir Ormond Winter, the Holy Terror as he's known, as Chief of British Army Intelligence, to basically get down to the job of smashing the IRA. And as Liz Gillis puts it, you know, Winter kind of plays the IRA at their own game. He recruits his own agents, and they live as civilians, as ordinary businessmen in houses around Dublin City. Some of them have been in Egypt, some have been in France, Belgium, Russia, but I think it's very clever. Like, the problem the British have is that the IRA is an invisible enemy. It moves among the people. You don't know who's in the IRA and who isn't. Winter believes in that approach, that you have Secret Service agents in Dublin, and unlike the G-Man, everyone knew who the G-Men were because they've been, you know, annoying them for years at political meetings and stuff. You shouldn't know who these people are. And they came close to breaking the IRA. Throughout 1920, a number of people that are very close to Michael Collins are arrested and questioned. So they're breathing down the neck of the IRA, and Lloyd George is confident enough to say, we have the murder gang by the throat, just weeks before Bloody Sunday. They think that the IRA is going to collapse in Dublin as a result of how effective these Secret Service agents are. So I think the feeling is that someone has to move in this kind of situation. And Frank Thornton, an IRA intelligence officer close to Michael Collins, he was taken in by Winter's people. He was interrogated by them very viciously. And the point that he makes and others make is, look, we have to go after these people. If we don't wipe these people out in Dublin, they're going to wipe us out. And Thornton is given the honour of compiling a list. He presents a full report to a joint meeting of the Dáil and the Army Council, IRA, and he proves that every man on this list is an accredited Secret Service man of the British government. And the point that Thornton always made is, at that meeting, Cathal Brugha and other people said, well, we have to know every one of these people is a Secret Service agent. We can't send people to the doors of these houses and shoot people and then it be revealed that they're, you know, that they're innocent of the charge. So Thornton makes the argument, and the list is greatly reduced. Apparently, some people say the list was as high as 70 names. More often they say about 55, but it came down to 35 men who will be targeted on the morning of Bloody Sunday. So the intelligence came from within the G Division. Ned Broy and others had some idea who some of the agents were. Lily Mernon, but weird places, like sometimes really mad places. Charlie Dalton remembered that a woman came to them and said, "There's, you know, suspicious people staying in the block of flats where I work." And Dalton said, "Well, will you get the waste bucket bin, get the waste paper bin?" And they went through the waste paper bin and they discovered intelligence that meant those men could only be Secret Service agents. So from all kinds of peculiar places, the intelligence was gathered for the morning of Bloody Sunday. 35 names on the list on the morning of the 21st of November. Like, to put that in context, there aren't 35 people killed in total that day, you know, between the morning, Croke Park, and the killings in Dublin Castle. There should have been more people killed just that morning had the IRA, had the operation gone entirely to plan. The IRA, the squad isn't big enough. The 12 apostles, it's all in the name, really. So they need to bring in other people. And the job of doing that falls on Sean Russell, photographed here, statue in Fairview, later chief of staff of the IRA, lives an incredible life, goes to Soviet Russia and then Nazi Germany in the 1930s, looking for military support for the IRA. But Russell was given the job of trying to bulk up the numbers, you know, that the squad could do it on their own. So we had to find willing men in the Dublin IRA that would take part in this operation. And apparently he tells them it's vitally necessary for the success of our fight that these spies be removed. No country has scruples about shooting enemy spies in wartime. And if any man had moral scruples about going on this operation, he was at full liberty to withdraw, and no one would think any the worse of him. He wanted every man to be satisfied in his conscience so he could properly take part in this operation. That's the recollections of an IRA man who was there the night before Bloody Sunday when Russell went through it. I think it says something, doesn't it, that British intelligence might not have been as good as the IRA feared, because they were talking about Bloody Sunday for a couple of days at least, and some people weeks before it happened, and British intelligence didn't know about it. They were taken by surprise. But the night before it, a lot of IRA men are very nervous. Young men, Charlie Dalton, 17 years of age, talks about this, the fear of it. You know, I was wrought up thinking of what we had to do the next morning, and I could feel that the other men were the same. Not everyone showed up the next morning. You know, some IRA men did bottle it on the morning. And I think you have to remember, this is very different from, even if you were involved in the 1916 Rising, there was a certain romanticism in the GPO, you know, firing a rifle out the window of the GPO, or, you know, being in Jacob's Biscuit Factory, singing out on the Veen. This was a very different job you were being asked to do. You were being asked to arrive at the door of someone, break it with a sledgehammer if they wouldn't open, make your way to wherever they were, and to shoot them and to take them out. So on the morning, there's an adrenaline in some of the lads who are really up for it, but other people don't show up when the job is being planned. Here's where the shooting happens that morning. This is from the Atlas of the Irish Revolution. Incredible map. Black, targeted and killed, red, targeted and survived. But as you can see, overwhelmingly, this is a really small pocket of the kind of the south inner city. When I say south inner city, in my head, I always think of, you know, the Liberties and kind of working class inner city Dublin. This is a very different south inner city. It's primarily kind of, you know, Georgian architecture. It's the old Georgian city, but it is a south inner city of a different kind. And you can see most of the shooting happens in this area. Upper Mount Street, Northumberland Road, Lower Bagot Street, Lower Mount Street, several addresses in the Mount Street area, Pembroke Street, Fitzwilliam Street, Earlsford Terrace. You know, it's a very small and compact area of the city. It's actually disputed if anyone was shot. That's my only issue with this map. the Shelburne Hotel. I don't think there was a shooting in the Shelburne that day, having dug on it a little bit. Certainly no IRA man ever came forward and said they were in the Shelburne that day. But the exception to the rule is on the north side, you'll see the Gresham Hotel. That's the only shots that ring out that morning on the north side of the River Liffey. There should have been more. Oh, sorry. First of all, a great first handy. There's Vinnie Byrne. You saw him earlier on. Hadn't changed a bit. Photographed in the 1970s. Byrne had absolutely no regrets about what he had done that day. He was a soldier acting on orders. He always maintained that. And he told the story to any journalist or kind of young student or historian who wanted to talk to him. He talked to everyone. He was very generous with his time. There he is standing outside the door, at 38 Upper Mount Street, which he'd raided. And very dramatic. This was taken and utilised in the movie Michael Collins. You might remember the line. I ordered the British officer to get out of bed. He asked me what was going to happen. I replied, nothing. I then ordered him to march in front of me. I marched my officer down to the back room where the other officer was. He was standing up at the bed facing the wall. I ordered mine to do likewise. When the two of them were together, I thought to myself, the Lord have mercy on your souls. And I then opened fire with my Peter. They both fell dead. Todd Andrews, C.S. Andrews, part of the Andrews dynasty, he wrote a great memoir, Dublin Made Me. There he is with Dev. And he remembered being sent to a house in Ranelagh, and the person that they were told to shoot wasn't there. So that could happen. And some of these men were actually saved by being Catholics because they were out for Mass. On a number of occasions, the targets were out at Mass. On the other side of the city, the North Circular Road, it would seem that volunteers lost their nerve. And Andrews recounted the fact is that the majority of the IRA raids were abortive. The men sought were not in their digs, or in several cases, the men looking for them bungled their jobs. Some of the dead are really serious people in the British Secret Service. This guy, Angus, won a Distinguished Conduct Medal with the Royal Enniskillens. He'd retired in March 1920, and he's recalled for special service duty months later. So for the Secret Service, he operates under an alias in the city, which sets alarm bells ringing. And he seems to have been in Russia just before this. The British were trying to unsettle the Bolsheviks. So he's a very respected figure in what they called the Special Service at the time, what we know as the Secret Service. Another guy, Francis Bennett, had served with the Intelligence Corps in France during the war, demobilized, and then called back up in the summer of 1920. I mean, these are people that are so good at Secret Service work. They're called back into the army as the situation in Ireland is worsening. But other people, the two men that are killed in the Gresham, I think are both innocent. Certainly veterans. I think they're both innocent of the charge against them. Thomas Herbert Smith is a landlord. His wife remembered, I saw some men coming up the stairs who appeared to number about 20 with revolvers in their hands. They then told me to put my hands up, and my husband came out in the landing and asked for some time to put on some clothes. I then asked if I could go into my baby in the next room, and they pushed me roughly into it. I then heard about 8 shots. He's a landlord of a house in which 2 Secret Service agents are staying, but there's no real charge against him himself of being a Secret Service agent. This is what's going to happen in an operation like this. You have 35 targeted assassinations in a morning. People are going to get caught in the madness. Civilians are going to get caught in the crossfire. And sadly, that's how it is in the case of the landlord, Smith. In London, the response is quite surprising, actually. Lloyd George basically says that these people were out-soldiered, that they were outgunned. Hammer Greenwood, a hard man of British politics, the main proponent of the policy of reprisals in Ireland. I mean, what he says is bizarre. He tells the King's private secretary that he was astonished at the carelessness of those who lost their lives yesterday morning. Not one of them had a revolver, whereas he never goes to bed without a revolver by his side and always carries one on his person. As far as Greenwood and others were concerned, these Secret Service agents had been outgunned by what they called the murder gang, and it was to some degree their own fault. So the chaos of the morning is followed by the high drama of the day, the challenge match at Croke Park. The game, it's all in the name, it's a game which the Tipperary players call for in the newspaper letter. Dublin are seen as the up-and-coming team of the day, and Tipperary basically put it up to them, and say, we'll play you anywhere, anytime, and for any cause. And for the Prisoner Dependence Fund, this charity match is to be played in Croke Park, 21st of November. It's hard to imagine there wouldn't have been some degree of intimidation at this game anyway, even if the events of that morning hadn't happened. It's for the prisoner dependence fund. There are kind of significant Republican figures on both teams. And by this point, the GAA is very much pinpointed by the authorities as a Republican organization. There have been a lot of run-ins between the British and the GAA in the years just before Bloody Sunday. Ironically, during the First World War, the relationship was better. I mean, one club in West Belfast lost so many players in the First World War, they had to disband themselves. The GAA was a much more, I suppose you might say, it was a much more diverse organization in terms of the politics of its members just a few years earlier. But in the immediate road to Bloody Sunday, it's a very Republican organization. The British introduced a ludicrous ban in 1918 where the GAA had to apply for a permit to play games. And the GAA responded by organising hundreds of symbolic games at the same time. They called that one Gaelic Sunday. They introduced a ban on members who'd taken the oath of allegiance in 1918. The oath of allegiance would have been taken by school teachers. All kinds of civil servants in Ireland would have taken the oath of allegiance, and public servants. And you were told you couldn't be a member of the GAA if you'd taken an oath. And that was a very, very Republican, very militant, hardline position. And the secretary, Luke O'Toole, who's in the middle there between Harry Boland and Mick Collins, was very closely aligned with the Fenians. So he was on the radar of British intelligence. You know, there were enough people, I think, in British intelligence and in the British military who would quite happily have made that game difficult to some degree. O'Toole had founded Croke Park itself. That was a great leap forward for the GAA. He was actually the first paid secretary of the GAA. So it said a lot about I know it's an amateur sport and has that amateur ethos, but it says a lot about how the GAA was coming to be seen as a serious force. That O'Toole, not only was he a paid secretary, he purchased the ground that we now know as Croke Park in 1913. Interestingly, the hill at the time was actually referred to as Hill 60. And again, that says something about the diversity of opinion that existed at the time after the First World War battle where Irish blood had been spilled in Belgium. Playing that day in Croke Park, Johnny McDonnell, Dublin goalkeeper, known as the man in the cap. He always played wearing a flat cap on his head. Johnny came from the very respected O'Toole's. O'Toole's was a GAA club that was just steeped in Irish nationalism. And incredibly, he'd been out that morning with the IRA. He hadn't fired any shots, but he was there at Upper Mount Street, the same job we heard about earlier on with Vinnie Byrne. I mean, it would have been known in some quarters, I think, that Johnny McDonnell was someone around the Republican movement. Hogan, 24, an active IRA man too. The night before the game, he stays in a pub owned by a guy called Phil Shanahan, Tipperary Republican, Dublin pub. He actually owned the pub in the middle of the Monto. It was kind of mad. But the night before, Michael Hogan stayed there. And Phil Shanahan does a Tipperary kind of very respected Tipperary Republican. He tells Hogan that morning that something's going to happen, something big is going to happen. And he suggests to him, as an IRA man, he says, you should probably go down the country. You know, you shouldn't stay, and you certainly shouldn't go to Croke Park for fear that there's going to be some kind of reprisal. The IRA went to Croke Park not long before the match began and basically begged Luke O'Toole to call it off. Sean Russell, who we met earlier on, made the point that it was likely there was going to be some kind of reprisal for the events of that morning. And Luke O'Toole insists, no, the game has to go ahead, because if we tell people now to leave, there'll be a panic in the ground. They'll all leave en masse. They'll rush for the gates. There might be a crush. So the GAA feels that the safest thing to do at the last minute is to go ahead and play the game. And I think the other thing is, think about it from the GAA's perspective. It might be a very Republican organization on one level, but it's also a sporting organization. It's primarily about playing sport. And if they were to call off the game, it might be seen in some quarters as an admission of guilt, that, why you're running away from something if you had no involvement in the events of that morning. So I think for all kinds of reasons, the GAA wanted this game to go ahead to show that, the GAA was primarily associated with sporting matters and not political ones. And just what happened that day is disputed. But the facts of history, the undeniable facts of history are this: the game was in its opening moments. The mixed force of police that arrived on the scene, auxiliary, military, TANs, even a handful of DMP, descend on the stadium. There is an armoured car. In Neil Jordan's Michael Collins, that armoured car comes right onto the field of play and begins firing. The armoured car is actually outside at St. James's Avenue. And that's important too, because it means that as people are running out of the stadium in a panic, the armoured car is firing on them and they're running back in. And a point I didn't know until I read Foley's great book, The Bloodied Field. I presumed that every person who died in Croke Park that day was shot, but actually some of them are killed in the crush. That you have people running out of the stadium and then kind of coming back in because of the fear of that armoured car outside. The first shots, the official account has it as fired by those inside the ground. That's doubted by everyone, even the conservative British press at the time. There are some voices who don't believe that line. One of the policemen tells the official inquiry, "I climbed through the turnstiles we were fired at. I returned fire 3 rounds at a party of men I thought fired at us." But it just doesn't stack up, and the claims that they find dozens of guns in the ground afterwards doesn't stack up. I mean, they find 1 gun, as Foley notes, within the ground afterwards. No significantly incriminating documents were found either. So the official line is basically that the party, a mixed force of police, are fired on by Republicans in the crowd as they enter the stadium to carry out routine searches. No one believes that. Every series of events, every recollection from people that were there tells a very, very different story. Daniel MacDonald, IRA intelligence officer, he went along to the game. And funny enough, he says himself that he had no interest in Gaelic games. He was a real soccer man. But he went along anyway. I think he wanted to get a sense of feeling in the city, feeling in the ground. And he talks about the madness when he sees this happening. "We suddenly realized the whole ground was under rifle and machine gun fire. We scattered and separated from one another on the hill. My hat fell off, and while I was picking it up, the man in front of me was shot. That should be. I was very fit in those days, ran across the back of Hill 16 over to the Ballybock Gate. I ran so fast that I was nearly the first to reach it." Really dramatic account of people just scattering, climbing over the walls of Croke Park. One man, one of the dead, helps people over the wall and then himself is shot and falls below onto the last person he lifted over the wall. In Britain, very few people believe the official account of the government. And the Labour Party in Britain was really starting to lose faith in the approach of the British government to the Irish question. I mean, they were horrified that Balbriggan was burnt, that Reneen and Clare was burned, that Kevin Barry, an 18-year-old medical student, was hanged. As far as the Labour Party in Britain were concerned, the government were just out to provoke. And they launched their own investigation into what was happening in Ireland after the burning of Cork a few weeks later. And brilliantly, the British Labour Party interviewed people that were there in Croke Park, and they got a very different series of events from what's in the official report. A ticket seller, Thomas Doyle nails it. He sees the first death and he describes it. "I was taking tickets at the turnstile entrance when I saw a boy fall from a tree close by. I then saw the Black and Tans coming from the direction of the bridge. They were firing. One of them ordered me to open the gate and threatened to shoot me if I did not. I opened the gate, and as soon as the Black and Tans got in, they began to fire towards the hill on the other side of the ground." Thomas Doyle's account of what happens is perfect. It matches up with so many other eyewitness accounts of the firing. The first victim, a young boy watching the game in a tree outside the ground. Absolute nonsense. A number of men came to Dublin on Saturday under the guise of asking to attend a football match between Tip and Dublin, but their real intention was to take part in the series of murderous outrages which took place in Dublin that morning. And they insist that it was the intention that an officer would go to the centre of the field and, speaking from a megaphone, invite the assassins to come forward. But on their approach, armed pickets gave warning. Shots were fired to warn the wanted men, who caused a stampede and escaped in the confusion. I mean, that line doesn't fly. And it doesn't fly even with the British public. I think one of the real effects of Bloody Sunday in Britain is that many people begin to question what the state, what the army are doing in Ireland. And I think that line is just dismantled so easily in the British press. The comparison that's made internationally is with Amritsar, disgraceful massacre in India earlier in 1919. Actually, unfortunately for Ireland's reputation, the man behind it was a General Michael Dwyer. But the Amritsar massacre in India had been front page news. These unarmed protesters fired upon by the British military. And in America, what happens in Croke Park is referred to, even Eamon de Valera, who was in America at the time on a speaking tour, they call it Ireland's Amritsar. It's very much compared to the earlier British massacre of 1919. 19. And it's a propaganda war that Britain loses. The front page of the New York Times is not the intelligence agents that are shot in the streets of Dublin. It's the massacre of civilians in Croke Park. And to bring us to the end of the talk, what a dramatic day, and the drama doesn't even end there. It ends in Dublin Castle. Two senior IRA men have been arrested the night before, Pater Clancy and Dick McKee. Pater Clancy and Dick McKee, we saw Pater earlier on, we saw his mugshot. They're the kind of prisoners, you know, who are always going to fall victim. Here we have the three men in Dublin Castle, Clancy, McKee, and a guy called Conor Clune. I think these men were doomed on one level. Dick McKee had been very much involved in the flying columns, in the assembling of flying columns, small armed groups of men that were attacking the British in the countryside. You know, he'd written up the guidebooks, if you will, the texts for that kind of campaign. Pater Clancy had been, at one point, the IRA's director of munitions, involved in arming the Republican movement. McKee and Clancy are very senior IRA men. They're personally interrogated by Winter when they're brought to Dublin Castle. And I think, given the events of that morning and the policy of reprisals that was very much in place, I think they were doomed to some extent. With them was Conor Clune. Conor Clune is a tragic story. He'd been a member of the National Volunteers. That was the pro-First World War volunteers. He's an Irish language activist. He's an Irish Irelander. You know, he's an Irish nationalist, but he's not a rifle-carrying member of the IRA. He was arrested the previous night in a raid on Vaughan's Hotel, which was a well-known Republican meeting place in the city, and later painted by Harry Carnoff, a brilliant Dublin painter. Clune was in the wrong place at the wrong time. He finds himself in Dublin Castle with McKee and Clancy. And the narrative, if you will, in the press is that they had tried to escape and that they were shot while trying to flee from the castle. No one believes it at the time. A commemorative plaque at Exchange Court, just beside City Hall in Dublin Castle, honours those men. It says, within these walls, Brigadier Dick McKee, Vice Brigadier Pater Clancy, and Volunteer Conor Clune. And it's one of the misfortunes, really, of the Bloody Sunday story. Conor Clune has been remembered as an IRA volunteer. And there's a certain heroism, I suppose, in the death of an IRA volunteer. But Clune was every bit as innocent as the people that were fired on in Croke Park. You know, he had no involvement in the IRA, and yet he ultimately lost his life because of a presumed guilt and association with it. So the day is one of chaos. And ultimately, it's worth saying that not everyone the IRA shot that morning was killed, and not everyone they were looking for was shot. But the impact of the day goes beyond, I think, just killing people. You know, essentially, I think it put fear into British intelligence, and they were far less likely to live outside of protected spaces. So, you know, there's great Republican propaganda after Bloody Sunday. They talk about spies and informers queuing up to get into Dublin Castle. You know, there's just rows of cars. You know, these people want to get behind a barrack wall, a castle wall. They're scared. And that's a deep psychological blow, I think, for the British. The idea that the IRA has driven the British Secret Service behind the walls of Dublin Castle. But at the same time, British intelligence was becoming much more effective in Dublin. And I think when you killed a G-man, like in 1919 when they were shooting G-men on the streets of Dublin, when you killed a G-man, everything he knew went with him. You know, Collins always said that an intelligence officer can't just be replaced. Someone can't step into their shoes and step into their knowledge. But under Winter, British intelligence was becoming a lot more, you know, formal, organized, filed, archived in Dublin. So the British still knew what they knew. Whatever they knew that morning, they knew it in its aftermath, despite losing those Secret Service agents. It was a much more serious war. I think losing McKee and Clancy was a massive blow, a hammer blow. And Liam Tobin, an IRA intelligence officer, Liam Tobin, insisted that it knocked all the good out of it that morning. We had no sense of jubilation as the enemy had evened up on us. You know, the loss of those two men and Michael Hogan, a volunteer in Croke Park, but especially McKee and Clancy, two senior IRA men, that was a real hammer blow, I think, for the IRA. And it's probably fair to say the IRA in Dublin was in a worse position after Bloody Sunday than the British Secret Service was. And as we witnessed last weekend, I think it's worth, you know, the legacy of the day is that it would have a massive impact on the GAA. You know, it's reflected in the naming of clubs across the island of Ireland. the Hogan stand, much more besides. That remarkable commemoration, for me, the highlight of the decade of centenary so far. I think a lot of the identity of the GAA as an organisation stems from the events of that day, Bloody Sunday. It certainly impacted on the GAA's identity and sense of itself. So I'd love to open that up, I suppose, to any questions or observations on the day. I do think it's amazing that 100 years on, there are still mysteries in that day. You know, there are still people shot that morning that we don't know everything about, disputed claims of other addresses and if gunmen went there or not. You know, even 100 years on, Bloody Sunday is still baffling the historians, and I find that in itself really remarkable.
Fantastic presentation, Donal. Thank you so much. It's so insightful. So, like any presentation, it poses as many questions as it answers in a lot of ways, which is fascinating too. One question in from Ray Keeley in the Swordsman Shed. You likened the events in Croke Park like to the Amritsar executions or murders in India. Ray asked the question, was in a certain way, was the motivation the same, that England felt it was losing its grip, it needed to show its ugly, brutal sides of power? You know, how high up did you think it went, the reprisal, the authority for the uprising?
I'm convinced it could not have happened without the approval of Winter, certainly. You know, something like that could not have happened without his approval. So that's high enough. You know, if it's gone right to the top of British intelligence in Dublin. Amritsar and what happened in India was particularly interesting, because India, like Ireland, was a diaspora. It was a global diaspora. There was a lot of Indians in London, a lot of Indians in the United States of America. And there was a kind of broad crossover in sympathy between Irish nationalists and Indian nationalists. Like when De Valera is in America, a lot of Indian people come to hear him speak. He speaks in Madison Square Gardens and there's a big Indian crowd at it. And the Indians were very keen to link their cause with Ireland. But I think Bloody Sunday and Amritsar gave them a direct link. And you do see pictures of banners at meetings in New York and Boston, San Francisco, that draw the comparison between the two events. So Amritsar probably goes no further than Dwyer himself orders the shooting. But in the case of Bloody Sunday, it would certainly, it would have gone at least as high as Winter, if not further. And that's what's remarkable about it. That the extent of that violence would not have been tolerated by Winter and the Secret Service in Dublin without some support or some endorsement, one might say.
It kind of leads to a follow-on question, if you like. Lloyd George, a Welshman and the last Liberal Prime Minister, he was elected in 1919, I think, and served till 1922. So this was kind of early days in his government. Was the brutal hand of England, was that was the policy? That was, so I suppose, I'm trying to make the link all the way to Lloyd George, which is probably tenuous.
I mean, Lloyd George was curious in the sense that he initially did not want to engage with the Sinn Féin political machine. And, you know, within a couple of short months, like by Christmas 1920, there's whispers and rumors that there's an openness to talking between the two sides. So maybe the brutality of Bloody Sunday, the brutality of that morning, and then the Kilmichael ambush, because a week later in County Cork, the IRA inflict very, very heavy losses at Kilmichael under the command of Tom Barry, who's a World War I veteran. He was in Iraq in 1916. He heard that the rising happened as a young British soldier in Iraq. And now in 1920, he's leading a flying column in County Cork. I think Kilmichael, the morning of Bloody Sunday, these things change how Lloyd George feels. But Lloyd George, initially, it's the murder gang. We don't deal with the murder gang. You know, they're not a political representation. But within a couple of weeks, the attitude had changed. So yeah, and Lloyd George famously, talking about Eamon de Valera, he said it was, dealing with de Valera was like trying to pick up mercury with a fork. He found the Irish impossible to deal with. And when Dev heard that, he said, next time try use a spoon. But eventually Lloyd George understood you had to sit down and talk with these people. And I think Kilmichael, and to some extent the fear of the morning of Bloody Sunday, may have impacted that.
And war is sometimes as much about perception as about reality and casualties and numbers. And it would be fair to say the English lost twice that day, in the sense that of the intelligence apparatus, not all of it, but some of it that the IRA knocked out, but also the fact that they lost the public. They lost the public war as well by open fire in what was, in essence, a sporting event.
Yeah, I mean, the public that they really lost, and there's still work for someone to do in this, and it'd be kind of easy enough work to do if you dig into the local papers. There've been a couple of big scenes in England, like Terence McSweeney, the mayor of Cork, died on hunger strike in Brixton.
Yeah.
And his funeral's massive. There's like tens of thousands of Irish people line the route that his coffin takes through the streets of London. And they're similar after Bloody Sunday. You know, there's the GAA clubs in Liverpool and Manchester, Salford, Glasgow. They all have their own little commemorations. They're marching behind black flags to the training fields. So I think in Britain, this was a disaster. And it was really hard to sell what was going on in Ireland as normal policing anymore. Like, one of the bad guys of 20th century British history, the founder of the British Union of Fascists, Oswald Mosley. Oswald Mosley was an MP at the time that all of this was happening. And he walked across the floor. He was so disgusted by British policy in Ireland. He said, we can't stand over this. What's happening in Ireland is morally wrong. And he walked across the floor. So, like, fundamentally conservative people who believed that Sinn Féin were murderers, that the IRA was a murder gang, and that there was a thing called British democracy that would prevail in Ireland. The British conservatives like that were starting to lose faith when they looked at the actions that day. I think Kevin Barry a few weeks earlier was a big deal too. You know, that Barry was so young, a medical student in his Belvedere jersey. I think there was a series of unfortunate events, you might say, from a British point of view, that the British public were growing kind of sick and weary of it.
An interesting angle on what was Luke O'Toole's legacy. In a way, he was asked if Sean Russell and the leaders of the IRA are asking you to call off a game. He says, no, we'll hold the game for whatever the motivation. You know, on one side, you could accuse him of radicalizing the GAA. On the other side, he's a GAA hero. What's your own opinion? Is it on what went on? What did he go on to afterwards?
Yeah, I think O'Toole can only be understood in the context of like Croke Park is the monument to Luke O'Toole. People say Luke O'Toole deserves a statue outside Croke Park. I always say Croke Park is a statue of Luke O'Toole because, I mean, he got the ground up and running in 1913. And Michael Foley in his book, it's a really beautiful picture. He paints of O'Toole and his wife like it wasn't the stadium we know today. If you're trying to picture the Croke Park of that time, I always say think of something like Dalymount Park, and then have that, you know, a kind of Victorian stadium like Daly, or half of that. Like, it was a very small space. And they talk about Luke O'Toole's wife on big match days pulling additional seats out from the O'Toole house that people could sit and watch matches. So him and his family built up the GAA as we know it. You know, O'Toole, the first paid secretary of the organization, constantly traveling the country. He loved the GAA in a way that probably no one since Michael Cusack had loved the GAA, and maybe no one since has. I think it's difficult to judge him on the basis of the call he made that day. And we have to wonder, had they let people out of the ground, because it was only minutes before kickoff that the IRA arrived there, or throw-in, we should say, soccer speak, League of Ireland speak there, before throw-in. Would there have been a massacre outside the ground? Anyway, you know, would these people making their way out of Croke Park have been fired upon? The blame might rest on the shoulders of the IRA for approaching O'Toole so late in the day.
Well, the stuff on McClerick from Shed up in Armagh makes that point. Actually, he's just made it. That was the IRA too late. Was it a? Yeah, was it a genuine attempt?
Sean Russell, Russell is someone who needs a biography. The problem with Sean Russell is that he never really made peace with the state. You know, he became the IRA chief of staff in the 30s, and he went to Soviet Russia, and then he went to Nazi Germany. He died on a German U-boat. And Russell, because he was such a hardline Republican till his dying day, he never gave a statement to the Bureau of Military. He never talked about what he had done, or he didn't live long enough to make a statement. But we don't really know much about the mind of Sean Russell, even though he's a fascinating character. And I'd love to know why they left it so late going to Luke O'Toole that day, because I think Russell and others should have been there hours earlier, putting the real pressure on O'Toole to call off that game.
I suppose as well, if you were to believe that the links were deeper, you would have thought they would have known about it anyway, having been planned the night before, or as you said, having been planned for weeks ahead of it. So I'm
amazed that McDonald showed up. You know, I'm amazed that Johnny McDonald, having been out that morning, showed up and, you know, played in goal for Dublin. I find that amazing that he didn't think, to some extent, maybe I shouldn't be there. Or Michael Hogan, who heard about it that morning, you know, before the events had actually unfolded, that he didn't travel back to Tipperary. I mean, I think maybe all those men felt that the best thing they could do would be to just continue. You know, that normality was the best cover in some ways.
The safety in numbers and yeah, no, it's the whole story's fascinating. Lily Mernon, what came of Lily, the little gentleman?
Lily married Pierce Beasley, who's in that photograph with her. Pierce very much took the pro-treaty side in the Civil War, found one of the founders of the kind of Cumann Gael party in the new state, and Lily kind of withdrew herself from politics. So unusually, most of the women remain kind of hardline, and most Cumann Amon went anti-treaty, overwhelmingly anti-treaty. You know, the women, big names like Markovich, Kathleen Lynn, Winifred Carney, Pierce's mother, Margaret Pierce, they all were very anti the new state, but Lily Mernon kind of set politics out, you know, after the birth of the state, and married Pierce Beasley. But yeah, an amazing life, and most importantly, she got her pension.
Yeah, and well deserved,
And Ned Broy, a great example to all public servants and trade unionists. He got a pension from the Gardaí when he retired, and he got a pension from the British state for his time.
Which says an awful lot. Donal, I can't thank you enough. I'm conscious of time. We'd love to do this again. We on another topic or extend this conversation. It's been really wonderful. The feedback's been huge. And thank you very much, Carol.
I want to thank everyone as well. I love the idea of the men's sheds, everything they do in communities around the country. And it's important in these times, if we all can, to get out and walk and see a bit of nature. But I do miss the talks, and it's nice to do them on Zoom. If this is what we have to do, we have to go into the digital shed for the next while, so be it.
Just for a while. Keep the faith.
Wonderful.
Slán.